Welcome to Jelly Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, we are inviting onto the podcast JJ Kimche, newly ordained doctor. JJ Kimche just finished his PhD at Harvard in Jewish Studies. JJ, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be here, and it's good to see the two of us have graduated from the trenches of Capstone to the rarefied world of podcasting. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk through important things with you.
Exactly. I think I've known you for, 15, 16 years by now. So it's been a lot of fun to, sort of watch our careers in some way develop in parallel. And, we are also both podcast hosts. And I will, at the end flag your podcast, which I constantly recommend to people. And your podcast is a lot more academic than mine. So we'll just get that out of the way. And you really talk to a wide range of Jewish study scholars about fascinating, historical circumstances of how different works arose. And it struck me, and this is one of the conversations that I wanted to have with you today, that there is, and also has for the last 200 years, been a tension within the Jewish community between academic scholarship of Judaism and traditional practice of Judaism. Right before we started rolling, we were talking about the Zohar, so maybe let's just start there. And this is sort of, a very easy case, and I'll give the sort of brief history, and then we can pass it along to you. If you drop into your average Orthodox community that's maybe a little bit to the right of modern Orthodox seems to be on the fence about this, and you ask, where does the Zohar, this, central canonical book of Kabbalah, come from? They will tell you it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in late first, early second century in the land of Israel, presumably when he was, living for many years in a cave. And then if you ask, academic historians, they would say this was written in the medieval Spanish period by Moses de Leon and others. And so even just thinking about this question, and we can sort of take this narrow case to unearth this wider clash. How do you think of this as somebody who is both embroiled within the world of traditional Judaism and academia?
Okay, so this is obviously a massive question, a great question. I love discussing this stuff. Before I get to the specific case of the Zohar, because you're right, it is a very revealing case study on this particular question. I have a couple of comments of a more general nature, and I want to set the table a little bit so that we know what we're talking about. So in terms of the clash between Jewish studies and, let's say, Jewish religion or Jewish tradition, there's the sociological and the intellectual. Okay, I want to put the sociological aside because, of course, part of the big clash that arose in the 19th century, which is my area of study, was between the traditional rabbinate, who always held power by dint of their superior scholarship within the Jewish community, among other things, and a new class of intellectuals, maskilim, Wissenschaft scholars, meaning historians, tutors, writers, journalists, editors, poets, a whole collection of newly literate Jews who were essentially claiming that same crown, who were rivaling the rabbinate for the very first time in history for their exalted status within the Jewish community by dint of their, at least equal in their eyes, expertise on the history of Judaism, on the meaning of Judaism, on the meaning of Jewish texts. I'd like to talk about that also, but let me put that to one side in a moment, because it seems to me this clash between, let's say, the academic and the traditional or the religious part of Judaism depends a little bit on your opinions on what your opinion on the scope both of Judaism and of the academic discipline in question that you are talking about, be it history, my area, be it science, be it any of the other fields of inquiry that could potentially clash with Jewish claims. And basically, in both of these areas, there are minimalist and maximalist claims that you can be. And basically, the whole clash, in my mind, I've sort of been turning this over in my mind, but hear me out. Let me know what you think of this. It depends how maximalist you want to be on both of these scales. Let me explain what I mean. In the area of, let's say, the Jewish tradition, right? There's the maximalist position regarding what Judaism claims and how much we need to believe. So, for example, the maximalist position would claim something like the following: that every single thing described in the Bible and rabbinic literature is 100% accurate, 100% historically factual, that 6 days of creation literally means 6 periods of 24 hours, the flood was literally worldwide, the Exodus story, the miracles of the Talmud, as related in the Talmud, in the Bible, etc., etc. All of these are 100% true and accurate and factual. That's, I'd say, let's say, the maximalist position with regards to the claims made by the Jewish religion. The minimalist position is something much closer to, well, these are all texts that reflect the ideologies and ideas that the authors themselves wanted to give over, but they're not necessarily historical, not necessarily scientific. We don't have to take them fully at face value, and they're much more geared towards imparting messages or showing God's grace or mercy or power or whatever it is, and lessons about the relationship between the Jewish people and God, rather than actually giving over facts about it. So that's sort of the minimalist, maximalist axis, let's say, within Judaism. And of course, within the study of the science of the history, there are similarly minimalist and maximalist axes as well. So let's say in the field that I know best, history, the maximalist view of history would go something as follows, is that, especially let's say when it comes to ancient history, that we know a lot, that the artifacts that have been left over give us a very good, very clear picture of ancient societies, that we know a great deal about what they believed and what they did and what they practiced and how ancient history actually went, and that the texts also produced by these ancient empires, the ancient civilizations, they are a very good window into the history. They tell us a lot about what happened, and we really know an awful lot, right? That's sort of the maximalist position. Whereas the minimalist position is something much closer to, the artifacts left over to us by archaeology are tiny and tiny in amount and extremely incidental and random and arbitrary, and really we don't have a very good window into ancient societies, and the texts that were produced by these ancient authors are not good historical texts, but rather relay the ancient, I don't know, biases or ideological impetuses that animated these ancient authors. And and of course they were serving power, and they were serving their own classes, they were serving their own interests, etc., etc. And that's sort of the minimalist position. And what I'm trying to say is that I think the clash comes when you're kind of a maximalist on both. Okay? In other words, if you're a maximalist on Judaism, you say the events or the sayings and doings that are related in the ancient Jewish texts, and the Tanakh and the Gemara and the Talmudic literature are exactly to be taken as fully factual and at face value on the one hand. And you also believe that science and ancient history and other such things that we have also give us a very, very good detailed picture of how the world once was, and sort of the development of religion, development of history, etc. Then those two do come into clash, right? But if one dials down one of these two sides, okay, if you take a less maximalist position about Judaism and say, listen, I'm willing to say that the 6 days of creation is not a fully scientifically accurate account, and that it is in fact maybe a grand narrative, a metaphor, or an archetypal structural portrayal rather than an actual physical portrayal of the early stages of humankind, then then that doesn't necessarily need to clash with science or with history. And the same, funnily enough, on the other side, in other words, if you are a maximalist when it comes to Judaism, but you say, listen, I actually don't think that ancient history is very good. I think that actually the historical record is very spotty and partial, and that we know almost nothing really about ancient society and about ancient literature, etc. And therefore, an enormous amount is simply the hypothesization of academics based on a very small amount of material information. If that's your position, then that also doesn't clash so much with Judaism, because you just don't believe so many of the claims made by history and made by science, etc. So I'm going to pause for breath because I imagine you have
No,
what to
so
say.
no, I love it. So what you're saying is it's only sort of people like us who are stuck in this, actual tension of ideas, which is great. I love living in tension of ideas. I
Nothing
do
wrong.
want to flag also, this is not only a last 180-year, debate. You could see this in the controversy surrounding Maimonides, right? So just to unpack this a little bit for listeners, and then maybe, this can be an interesting historic plug-in. Maimonides obviously about, a generation or two before the Zohar, but, similar place, starting off in Spain, ending up in Cairo. Maimonides, famously or infamously gave somewhat of a socio-historic account for many of the commandments, right? So probably the most famous one is where Maimonides is, dealing with the laws of the temple and the laws of sacrifice. And at least this is my read. If you disagree, let me know. But he seems clearly uncomfortable with a lot of the rituals that seem very similar to idolatrous rituals that are just done in either the tabernacle in the desert or the temple in Jerusalem. And so he essentially says, this was God's plan to wean the Israelites off of idolatry, right? So you can imagine, a full spectrum that Maimonides sets up, from a bunch of people worshiping some physical representation of God. For Maimonides, even physical representation included, people trying to represent God in language. And all the way on the other side is what Maimonides might view as the ideal. And this is sort of pure intellect slash philosophy without any of the need for these sort of, human described anthropomorphizations of God or even human centric rituals. And Maimonides essentially says, and this is according to one reading of Maimonides, but it's the one that I think I agree with, the vast majority of the mitzvot and the rituals for Maimonides falls along the line of that spectrum of this actually isn't the ideal way to serve God, but it's, what we have to almost wean us there. This led, as many, detractors to Maimonides wrote, over the next 100, 200 years in both northern Spain and southern France, a laxness that started propagating among, followers of Maimonides. Because, of course, meaning, the example that I always give to students when giving this example is, if there's a commandment to eat matzah on Pesach, which of course there is, and Maimonides or a later, medieval thinker says, here is the reason, right? I figured out the reason, and the reason is either for this intellectual or philosophical or moral reason. I can sit here in the year 2025 and say, hey, if the entire reason of eating matzah is that I sympathize with, let's just, this isn't necessarily Maimonides' view, but I sympathize with what it might mean to be a slave. Why don't I just sit around and watch an hour-long documentary on the horrors of slavery? And that might even be much better than eating matzah, which, these days, obviously matzah, tastes good and people look forward to eating it, versus, sort of the other position that would rail against, this whole aspect of, trying to find the reasons for the commandments, who would just say, no, there is something essential about eating matzah that even if we can speculate as to maybe 5% of the reason, there's still going to be this essentialized barrier that at the end of the day, this is, from God and everything like that. So this has been a last 1,000-year controversy within Judaism. But it does, if you take the minimalist claim of Judaism, and I'm curious if you would agree with this also, it does at some point reduce many people's allegiance to, the stricters of the law. And, just a social example, right? If a lot, it's no secret. And, 2 episodes ago, I talked about, with Naomi Seidman about women in the ultra-Orthodox community, right? If you believe in the maximalist Jewish claim that, everything, not just in the Talmud is true, but, even to just add to your maximalist claim, it's all from Sinai, and, even the ideas of 20 or 21st century rabbis in some way is actually just evoking this ancient tradition, then you don't have a clash, because you say, well, the modern idea of feminism sort of, is irrelevant, who cares about that? But once you start to have this socio-historic view and you say, well, of course it developed for there to be a sort of, patriarchy and, sexism, right? I don't want to use that word too strongly, but within the traditional Jewish account, because it was written by 99% males, as were almost all texts across history, that would then move you to say, like, okay, well, in 2025, we should have full equality and rabbis. So it does, go from the intellectual, and I think, at least for me, it does seep into the practical. I said a lot, so I'll throw it back to you.
You said a lot of things. So firstly, by far the most objectionable thing you said there was the fact that matzah tastes good and people look forward to eating it. That is arrant nonsense, obviously, and must be objected to first and foremost. And the second thing, I think it's important to point out when talking about the minimalist maximalist thing, is that obviously these things exist on a spectrum. In other words, the reason I pointed out minimalist and maximalist is because almost anyone who's any kind of believing anything in any religion exists across somewhere in the spectrum. Meaning there are many people who don't quite take the maximalist view, but obviously don't take the minimalist view, and are willing to say, Judaism does make some truth claims. Let's say, for example, and I agree with you, let's say a lot of people who would be fine giving up the Genesis story as a sort of an extended allegory, and would be fine, let's say, giving up the flood of Noah because, in a global flood that left no trace in the natural history. Okay, we can sort of give that up because, but many of them would be very loath to give up the Exodus, right? Would be very loath indeed to say, the Exodus from Egypt didn't happen. Okay, so then why am I sitting around in a Seder night celebrating this? Like, I'm not staying up till 2 a.m. eating horrendous food to celebrate an abstract idea of freedom that can be applied at any place, anytime. No, most people want to actually anchor that in a genuine historical experience which took place within their forefathers. But I do the point I want to get, especially when you touched on Maimonides, is a very important point. And an important point for Maimonides should be an important point for us, is that while gauging the seriousness of these clashes, we have to take into account what we think is the seriousness, or let's say potential veracity of the disciplines with which we are dealing. What I mean by this is as follows. In Maimonides' mind, the philosophical aspects, meaning his philosophical discoveries, philosophical beliefs, he really thought were 100% true and could be proved to the same degree that mathematics could be proved. In other words, for him, God exists and is incorporeal. And if you denied that, for Maimonides, you're like denying 2 + 2 = 4. Like you are simply intellectually incompetent, or don't know how to follow conclusions from premises at all, right? And truly believe that. And many medieval theologians really did believe that. They really believed that the reasoning was so sound that the conclusions of philosophy, and therefore when Maimonides makes or is willing to I don't know if allegorize is the correct word, but willing to reinterpret the canonical text based on, let's say, a very firm philosophical a foundation that he has, very firm philosophical belief. So he's doing that based on what he really thinks is something absolutely indefeasible and scientific in the most sort of epistemologically sound kind of way, right? Whereas he contrasts this, let's say, something like history, right? History, especially ancient history, even the best historians will admit to you, is often, especially ancient history, is often suppositious. It's often based on theories, often there's a lot of filling in of gaps that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we think we know, but it's really based only on one source. For example, I mean, it's a melancholy fact about ancient Jewish history how much of it relies on Josephus. Like an enormous amount of what we think we know about the Second Temple relies on Josephus, and the question is, well, how accurate was Josephus? How correct was he? How, to what extent was he reporting accurately? So I think that distinction has to be born, especially with the Rambam, because I imagine the Rambam, if you confronted him in the 12th century and said, listen, you know, let's take a look at how you're dealing with the biblical text based on your philosophy and based on your historical understanding of how ancient Israel and ancient civilizations worked, he'd be much more willing to give up the latter. He'd be much more willing to say, listen, maybe I don't know so much about how the ancient Canaanites practiced their idolatry, and therefore, I'm willing to if you could demonstrate to me otherwise, I'd be willing, or give me good reason to believe otherwise, I'd be willing to sort of shift my beliefs based on that. But his philosophical worldview, his metaphysics, would be much less willing to do so. And I think that's important when discussing different clashes, let's say, between claims that religion purports to make and the claims of other disciplines. You have to ask, okay, how good are these claims that other disciplines are making? Meaning, you could say that the claims of physics, let's say, are I mean, again, I'm no physicist, but seem to be quite sound. Things like the age of the universe, or the fact that evolution exists seems to be based on a sledgehammering amount of evidence, and therefore, it would be reasonable to be able to reinterpret the first chapter of Genesis in a manner that is friendly to the theory of evolution. Fine. But then to say, listen, we don't really have, let's say, going to the Exodus story. Well, how much do we know about the ancient Israelites, where they come from? Were they in ancient Egypt or not? And the answer is fragments, fragments, a little bit here, a little bit there. And therefore, I think one is much more capable of saying, I'm unwilling to throw over cherished ancient national traditions about where we come from, and the whole point of our religion. I'm not willing to throw that up based on a discipline that its own practitioners will admit has much more ignorance than knowledge.
I think that's really interesting. Just two things I want to flag, and one maybe a clarification. There is still a clash, even within that, which I really love and I agree with. And I spent many moons trying to scour over the evidence for the historicity of the Exodus, lack thereof. It's a very interesting academic sugya, for lack of a better word. Maybe one of these days I'll do a podcast episode just about that. But even in the basic methodological approach of historians using something akin to the scientific method, and you're also not really starting off with an end conclusion. In other words, you could imagine, the same way, we can just stick in Maimonides now because he's on my mind because I've been teaching about him all week last week. Maimonides takes earlier Jewish philosophers such as Saadia to task for being a part of the school for, generally called, Kalam, mostly an Islamic school, but also borrowed by, early medieval Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish thinkers for essentially saying, they're not starting off with open inquiry and following the evidence. They're starting off with their conclusion and then, playing a game of rationalism and philosophy to actually get there. So I think there is that still methodological clash. And I'm not saying that all historians are engaged in this sort of Platonic ideal of, research and everything, halavai, if only that was the case. Everybody has their bias, and, that's true regardless of where you sit on the religious or political spectrum as well. But at least that is one general methodological clash as well. So maybe we can actually, just start there. The other thing, just to take a big step back, is I think you're talking more about the generalities, which I totally agree with. And it would be sort of odd if me as the rabbi took the the anti-traditional pro-academic stance, and you as the academic, flip. That I think would make for a very interesting listening here. But once you drill down to the specifics, I was involved in a conversation with a grad student last night about the origin of eating cheese and chicken together, right? And obviously the Talmud addresses this, and Maimonides attempts to provide post hoc rationale. And this is even one of those cases where essentially later Jewish thinkers admitted, there's no actual biblical prohibition against mixing this together, right? The rabbi set up a fence because they were worried you might mix up your beef and chicken and everything like that. But even just knowing that has led at least this one grad student to say, well, I'm never going to eat cheeseburgers because that's unkosher, but what's unkosher about this? Now, again, there's other internal halachic reasons to say, well, that's not how legal systems work. Legal systems sort of have their own internal mechanisms of interpretation, and that's how all legal systems work. But, I do think there is something to your average traditional Jew, or even your average Jew who's not traditional but has a traditional view of Judaism. Many of the Jewish students in my class, they're not traditional Jews, but they're Jews who have traditional views of Judaism. In other words, do they keep kosher or are they Shomer Shabbat? No, but would they still affirm, of course the Exodus happened, of course Abraham existed, of course, the Talmud is, part of some system that was passed down to Moses at Sinai. When you then dig down into the historicity, there is a fear that I have, teaching from the academic side of, it seems like you could go on the slippery slope to reducing everything to historic circumstance. And for someone to say, so you mean the only reason why Jews don't eat pig is because of, X, Y, and Z theory of, why pigs were seen as unclean in the ancient world?
Well, firstly, I think the last comment you made is very important when you said the theory about why pigs were. In other words, it's important to note when having these discussions with students and with anyone is to know that there is a fair amount of theorizing and hypothesizing in such disciplines. Now, of course, they are based on something. I mean, they aren't just plucked out of thin air, but nonetheless, it's important. I mean, I'll give a very basic example for those who are a little bit knowledgeable about biblical criticism, right? This was a subject we were discussing a little bit before, and sort of the theories that arose among Germanic scholars in the 19th century about how the Chumash, the five books of Moses, the different sources within them, and how they actually came to be written, and in which order. Now, this is an important thing. In which order they came to be written, where basically the theory is that the J and E are some of the oldest, and then the Deuteronomist comes around, shortly before the destruction of the first temple, something like that, or during, and then P is like the latest, the most the priestly, the most sort of the most administrative Mishkan or Mikdash based source of all the sources of the Chumash. Now, what is important to note, of course, about this is that one of the major reasons why this particular list of sources, why these sources were put in this particular order, is because of the regnant theory of the development of religion within Germany, within Europe in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, which was essentially that religion started as this kind of freewheeling, free-flowing, very local folk-based kind of worship that eventually became tied with the administrative state, and then eventually became tied in with a priestly administrative class and became ritualized and became, kind of ossified in that way. It's a degradation of religion. It becomes, formalized into rules and becomes the preserve of a particular class who know the rules and can therefore exert power based on the rules. Anyway, because of this sociology of religion that was very that a lot of credence in Europe in the late 19th century, this view of how the Bible developed became, the Wellhausian view of how the Bible developed basically became, had most intellectual credence. And this is actually a very important state to notice. In other words, that there is, of course, the textual analysis, but all those who were studying it had in their minds this preconceived notion of how religion ought to develop. And nowadays, we simply don't give that much credence to that particular evolutionary view of religion in general. And therefore, a fairly significant portion of why scholars initially gave credence to this way of looking at the development of the Chumash is somewhat undermined. I want to. There are a couple of things you mentioned that are very important. I want to touch on. The first is that you mentioned, me taking on the rabbinic side, you taking on the academic side, and the clash between the two. It's very interesting that it occurs to me that you often find, or a typical analysis of the phenomenon known as postmodernism is that it is inimical to religion, right? That the postmodern idea of breaking down all narratives, of casting doubt on all possible coherence and all possible traditions and truth and morality and God, and basically the disintegration of all the central concepts that guided Western civilization for centuries and centuries. This notion of postmodernism is usually seen as absolutely inimical to religion and tradition. Whereas what's funny is that from the perspective of the conversation that we're having, postmodernism actually becomes the friend of religion, because the actual danger to, let's say, the Jewish narrative, the Jewish belief, was Enlightenment style research, or faith in history and faith in science and faith in all of these disciplines as recovering absolute truths of the ancient past. And so if you speak for anyone between Spinoza and, let's say, the early 20th century, they'll say that's what we're doing. We're absolutely we can, through our own intellect and through applying objective truth-seeking laws of the philologist and of the historian and of the textual critic, we can actually very very clearly and unambiguously uncover the true history of the Bible, the true history of ancient Israel. And the postmodern critique is actually, it was interesting in that, is that no, all intellectual activity and all writing and all history is actually that there's a myth. The objectivity is a myth, and actually, really, what history is the is part of this power game. It's part of this societal power game where those who occupy certain positions within the academy or within society will want to craft narratives that are flattering to whichever, the administration or the government or whatever, or societal narratives that they want to pursue, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very interesting, because then if you're criticizing the criticism, if you are undermining that which seeks to undermine, then you're almost back at square one. In other words, if you take if you take the postmodernist critique of contemporary scholarship seriously, and that really undermines a lot of science, undermines a lot of history, undermines a lot of sociology and anthropology and all the other disciplines of inquiry, then you are, I wouldn't say you're back where you started, but you've done a great you've taken a great step towards undoing some of the quote unquote damage that some of these disciplines will go through. Finally, before I'm sure you have what to say on this, I want to tell you a quote that I love. It's one of my favorite quotes that lives with me a lot. Sort of occupies rent-free real estate in my head while I'm practicing my own craft. It's by Edward Gibbon, who was an English historian of the late 18th century. He was the author of the monumental rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or decline and fall of the Roman Empire, rather, one of the great historical works of the Enlightenment. But he said the following, which I think it speaks to our difference between philosophy and history when it comes to studying religion. It's a wonderful quote. It goes as follows. The theologian may indulge the pleasing task of describing religion as she descended from heaven, arrayed in her native purity. A more melancholy duty is imposed on the historian. He must discover the inevitable mixture of error and corruption which she contracted in a long residence upon earth among a weak and degenerate race of beings. Okay, it's a sharp quote, and I think this speaks to a little bit of the questions that your students were posing to you, which you can say as follows. Listen, obviously, Judaism as a religion seeks to, let's say, live out, instantiate, actualize certain truths and certain moral principles that we've received, that we believe is divine, that we believe is in some sense ultimately objectively correct and true. It is also the case that religion is a human phenomenon. It is also the case that religion has a history. It is also the case that religion has been entrusted to the sages of each generation to develop in one way or another. And as with everything in history, it develops in one direction, then another direction. And then, sages of one generation thought this was important, and then another generation thought that was important. And basically, over the centuries and centuries and centuries, in different historical, ideological circumstances, there was sort of an accretion of various things that I wouldn't say crept in, that were simply adopted and they were taken on as part of this. And the chicken and milk thing is a great example of this. Like, yes, what you can say, was this part of the original blueprint of Judaism? Maybe not, you could argue, but given that it is also a historical phenomenon, and given that we as human beings are also interested in being in being part of the historical phenomenon, in being part of the community that developed in this way over the centuries. So we voluntarily agreed to take on the things that have characterized Jewish life for hundreds and hundreds of years, even if we know that is historically conditioned to a certain degree.
Okay, I'm going to completely scratch everything I wanted to say about the first half, and just, my mind immediately in that, last bit about postmodernism went to the Zohar and really just the entire Kabbalistic tradition. I don't know if you meant to go there, and I know you've done a lot of research on the Zohar, so maybe this conversation could sort of naturally go that way, but at least from what I know about the Zohar, which, I do not claim any expertise, as I always like to say on podcasts, every yeshiva I ever went to, the Zohar was not studied, which I think says a lot about, the contemporary, Orthodox world and yeshiva world. That's for another podcast. But this idea of
course, if you did have expertise in the Zohar, you wouldn't be able to tell me. So my suspicion is still there, naturally.
Okay, there we go. The Zohar really does bifurcate this question into, there is the Ein Sof for the world of, pure truth according to later Kabbalists, and then there is the either the God who interacts with creation, right? If you want to take the Zohar's philosophy, or even, later Kabbalists, and Gershom Scholem talks about this, once they start to get, even more radical, there are some Kabbalists that even have views that the version of the Torah that we have now is not the sort of, real version of the Torah. And there's some, again, Platonic ideal. I use the, Greek philosophic terms, even though that probably would have upset, some of the Kabbalists. But, you have this, Platonic Torah that we can't get to as humans. And so we're stuck with this, very human-centric Torah that deals with very human-centric concerns, such as pure and impure and kosher and not kosher, but in the, realm of pure truth, right? There's no such bifurcation between, one side or the other, which, on one side, leads to a whole bunch of fascinating movements like Shabtai Tzvi on the one hand, of people who try to tear down that boundary. But on the other hand, at least for the purpose of this conversation, I think it really does allow people to exist simultaneously in these worlds of what, you were calling postmodernism, to some extent, which, perhaps that's why the sort of Kabbalistic tradition ended up, really beating out the Maimonidean tradition, because Maimonides really was, no, this is true, on the metaphysics side, and we can prove this and we can display it. And so all it takes to sort of brush aside Maimonides' theory is, a new theory of metaphysics or of physics or anything like that. And, Maimonides is still valuable, but, I think you actually interviewed him on your podcast, Len Goodman, who came out with a new translation of the Guide to the Perplexed, and he also came out with a, descriptor, where he, talks about his views. And his last chapter on in the book is, why should we care? And he starts off with, 2 paragraphs of saying all of the things that Maimonides, underpinned his philosophy that are no longer true, in terms of, his view of how the universe works, that were very much, a la Aristotle. And then, he pushes as to why Maimonides is still relevant, which, full disclaimer, I also think he's still relevant. But that is a lot harder of a philosophy of like truth and untruth to jive with. And I do think the Kabbalistic tradition like pushes us slowly in the right direction. I don't know if you want to use that as a jumping off point. It is also ironic, I'll point out, that the first question I asked was about the historicity of the Zohar being, from Shimon Bar Yochai versus Moses de Leon. I personally, as I think you do too, from listening to your podcast about this, subscribe to the view that this was a, medieval Spanish Jewish project, for all the reasons that, maybe if you want, we can get into. But still, I don't think that challenges the fundamental claims about reality that the Zohar and the later Kabbalistic tradition is making, which again, very much allows, me, I'll just get into my own philosophy, to sit down for a Passover Seder and fully be enveloped within the traditionalisms of a Passover Seder. And maybe the day before the Passover Seder, I spent the whole time talking with somebody about how this is, according to some scholarly takes, this is just, some Judicized version of a Greek historian. And according to other, historic takes, this entire thing was just developed to kind of like push back against Christianity. And, there's all these different theories about the Seder. And, you can know that. And then when you sit down for your Seder, you sort of engage it with your, full self without being, oh, but you do realize that the only reason why, we do Korach is because of this, historic anomaly. It's like, when I'm sitting down for a Seder, like, I don't want to hear that. Like, that's not part of what I'm doing right now.
Okay, you said a great deal there, and I want to comment on a few select aspects of that, which are very interesting and very much worthwhile. So first, you actually pointed out what I call the underrated and unspoken about crisis of Jewish philosophy, which goes on till this day, and I don't think anyone's really dealt with it probably properly, which is that it remains the case to this day that all the major foundational works of Jewish philosophy were written in a time and an ideological context to which we no longer subscribe. We no longer believe in much of the scaffolding, the medieval metaphysical scaffolding that held up the works of people like Saadia Gaon and Rabbi Levi and the Rambam and the Sefer Ikarim and all the major works of Jewish philosophy to which curious Jews tend to turn their attention. Much of it has the idea that everything in the world has a tachlid, the sort of a final purpose, a telos to each entity in the world, and that there exist, these galgalim, these heavenly spheres in which the planets exist, and each one is connected to an independent mind, a sechel hapoel, and each one moves in order to get closer to, because it has a desire to connect with its intellect. No person in the modern era believes any of this, and yet so much medieval Jewish philosophy is written within the context of this, and therefore, and assuming this, and defending it, and arguing about it, and therefore that is what I would call the crisis of Jewish philosophy. And it's funny, Judaism hasn't really created new philosophical like groundwork, the bedrock texts really, to deal with a world post-Kant and Spinoza, post-Rousseau, that really no longer believes in a large portion of what's believed there. So that's the first thing I said. The second thing is you mentioned how Kabbalah um, beat out Maimonidean rationalism. The truth is that the main reason, it seems to me, anyway, if you're to give my unsolicited opinion, but it connects to the question and the conversation we're having. The main reason I think that Kabbalah did beat out rationalism in general is because it gives a much better rationale for those Jews who want to keep halacha, for those Jews who are performing things on a daily basis. Because if you're following the Maimonidean position, well, why am I putting on tefillin, or why am I shaking a lulav if I'm Maimonidean? You say, well, the Torah exists in order, it gives mitzvahs in order to, perfect the body and perfect the mind and perfect society, and therefore each act contributes to a kind of virtue ethics which you eventually build, and that gains you a closer intellectual love of God, which eventually ties you to. But the necessity and the consequence of each individual act is almost doesn't exist. It's almost arbitrary. Like I could be shaking a lulav, but I could be doing something entirely different as long as it contributes to the eventual sharpening of my mind and the perfection and purification of my theological beliefs. Then fine, that's all I have to do.
Well, this is sort of the exact example I gave before about the matzah and the documentary on slavery. I mean, you're totally right, which I think gets into this wider tension. Sorry, I cut you off before.
If you are a Kabbalist, you say, why am I doing this thing? Because this thing was commanded by God, not because it has some incidental benefit in the construction of the ideal human being. No, this thing is crucial in the delicate interdependence of the supernal realms. And therefore, by shaking a lulav, I am affecting this cosmic tikkun, this cosmic restitution between the different sort of finely balanced aspects of the divine Godhead, of the divine sort of ecology up there. And by doing so, I am shaking the entire universe. Every single time I do a tiny thing, it has these massive cosmic knock-on effects. The eventual effect.
Dare I say, and let me know if you think I'm doing this. Call me out. If you talk to somebody who was really steeped in Kabbalah, say you dropped into France in the mid 1300s or early 1300s. I think Jews were expelled from France sometime in the early 1300s, if I have my dates right. And you would have asked them, is the lulav really doing all those things? They might have shut the door and said, well, there's actually two different things here, right? There's God, the idea that God wants you to be shaking this lulav and that you're fixing God and, ushering in this tikkun, like that is true according to one side. And yet on the other side, that actually isn't true in a way that, does allow for, again, this more of a, I almost picture it like one of those optical illusions where, you look at it one way and it's, you have the spherot and you have this, brokenness that the Arizal later on talks about. And then you look at it on the other side and it's like, you're back to Maimonides, and, Kabbalah sort of exists, oscillating between those two poles and, very much within that paradox. But it does allow you, from some perspective, if somebody were to say, I don't believe that God ever, split the sea in half, or, I don't believe that the Exodus happened. Let's just say somebody uses that example. Within Kabbalah, a Zoharist could say, we don't really either. And again, let me know if you think that's just me reading too much into that, but we think that it doesn't actually make sense also to say, God came down and split a sea in half.
Okay, so let me say the following. I don't think you'd find any Kabbalists denying the Exodus. I mean, until the late 20th century or something. Until you have all the neo-Kabbalah that comes in the United States, post the 70s, etc. But no, what the Kabbalists would say to you is, you think the Exodus was a big event? The physical story of the Exodus that is written down in the text that we have in the Torah is like the most surface aspect of that phenomenon. Really, the real drama was taking place on this grand spiritual cosmic level between the powers of Egypt and the powers of Israel, and different angels and different other cosmic powers of various sorts. And therefore, okay, the Exodus, history schmistery, okay, prove to me that this scratching on a wall says this, and this text says that, and this archaeological discovery says this, but actually it doesn't affect like the true depth of what's going on in the text. And if you believe that the text and the words of the Torah are the merest garb, the most almost incidental external covering of the main thing in the middle, which incidentally Maimonides believed as well. He just believed that the inner covering wasn't sort of the 10 spherot. It was actually medieval neo-Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. But put that to one side. So that's a way of getting around it. In other words, someone could say, I deny the historicity of this, or I don't think this happened. The capitalists will almost shrug and dismiss that. It's almost like um, I'm trying to think of another phenomenon. There are many, let's say, if you go to a physicist and say something like, I don't know if Einstein was right, or I don't know, like a sort of very pop science critique of physics. The real quantum physicist will say, you're talking about the tiniest bit that you understand, the sort of thing you read once in the bathroom in like Reader's Digest or something. Like I deal with the craziest equations and the most unbelievably deep theories that you could ever possibly imagine. Therefore, like your little sort of nitpicking at the sort of childish version of what I'm trying to do doesn't bother me in the slightest, right? And that, it's the same if you ask like a very serious theologian about a very childish question about God. Like, yeah, okay, you can have that. You can have that if you want, but what I'm dealing with is something obviously much deeper and much more serious and much more impressive and important. But anyway, just quickly back to what you were saying. So I think that's why Kabbalah eventually won, namely that if it is the case that the Jews in exile, especially post the expulsion of Spain, really what they were deprived largely of political power and they were constantly persecuted, and they really had a lot of a great deal of a difficulty and misery and of all various kinds in the medieval and early modern period. So then investing each individual act with cosmic significance, with endless significance, that gives a kind of power that lends a kind of that fuels a kind of fire under the devotional believer that is unparalleled. And they can say that, the poor, Tevye the milkman, who's returning home after a day of, of trying to milk his cow and deliver his milk into the village, comes home and davens mincha. He can say, I'm doing something more powerful than the Tsar of Russia. The Tsar of Russia is moving around armies and has, endless money and endless power. Me saying a few words to God, that is even more powerful and has even more greater effect than anything he could ever do in his life. And of course, that gives a kind of that lends a kind of raison d'etre that no rationalist philosophy ever could. And that seems to me the main reason why it won. It's just a much more powerful motivator. That doesn't mean it's correct. That doesn't mean it has theological veracity. It just means it's a much better a motivator in that sense. I would say the last thing that you said also bears thinking about. I don't know if I have a very definite opinion on the subject, but it's something that we're thinking about of the virtue of leaving your brain at the door sometimes. In other words, you mentioned the Seder, right? The Seder night, for those who've been in a really good Seder night, know how powerful an experience it can be. The rituals and the singing and the storytelling and the arguments and the physical, visceral reliving of an event that has been relived and retaught and retold for thousands of years, literally. It's an extremely powerful experience and affords you a glimpse into, let's say, a plane of experience which isn't available most of the year, isn't available through most mundane experiences. The best way to ruin that is to come to the table with a history book and go, I don't know. We have this stela that says that the Egyptians defeated Israel 12th century BCE. So when could the Exodus plausibly have happened? Was it Ramesses II? Was it different? Maybe it was just this, maybe it was that. That is in many ways destructive, but not to the belief, but to the power of the experience. The same with prayer, obviously, meaning there's no shortage of good philosophical, theological works trying to investigate what prayer is, how it could possibly work, what are you trying to achieve, trying to do, etc. But if you bring that into shul and try and stop your prayer experience in order to open this book and try and pass out the philosophical back and forth of what prayer could be, something very serious, something very important is lost in that experience. And therefore, as I said, these aren't fully baked thoughts, but I think there could be a virtue in occasionally, especially when you're entering into something that the experiential aspect is at the center of it, to leaving your brain by the door.
Yeah, and I think the way that I would almost, obviously I'm not making a qualitative comparison, but if we were going to sit down to a game of basketball, you
Mhm.
know, it wouldn't help if every single time, something happened, somebody was like, well, what are the rules of traveling really meant for? And like, does it really make sense? You could take two steps and then a pivot foot, and you're like, wouldn't, at some point, if you want to play basketball, me and you both know what basketball is. We are both bought into the rules of this game. And we're not saying anything about the underpin structure of the game necessarily while we're playing it, right? That we can maybe, if we're sitting around on the couch after a good 2 hours of basketball, we can discuss, theory of basketball and whatever. But like when I'm playing basketball, I want to be playing basketball, not, a large discourse about, I don't know, the theory of fouling. And, I have started to think about Judaism more and more like that, especially as I, am a part of, both of these worlds intellectually at the same time, where I just don't need that to come into my, when I'm at a Seder or when I'm at a Shabbat meal or, praying. I don't want to bring all that stuff in, even though that is there. So it's not necessarily fully checking the intellect at the door, but it's almost like, just the other example, I don't know, let's pick a strategy game, right? So, we're playing Settlers of Catan, right? That, obviously you have to be smart within the game to play it. But again, it wouldn't be fun if we sat down and we're like, well, do these rules really make sense? And wouldn't it have been better if they made the board a different way? So you're still using your intellect, but within the prescribed rules of the game, as opposed to constantly spending your whole time saying, well, what actually underpins this game? There is a time and place for that, but it's not while you're actually playing the game. It's, while we're sitting around thinking about the game after. And, I don't know if this matches along the lines of Kabbalah as neatly as, the last argument I was trying to make, but I think at least for me, that's how I answer this question of, I don't try to go to that ultimate fusion that maybe somebody like, a Rav Soloveitchik in the 20th century, very much wanted to push this full synthesis of, Torah Umada, right? Or, earlier iterations, right? Torah im derech eretz of, you have Torah on the one side and the worldly endeavors on the other, and you're, engaged in this constant dialectic and trying to figure out how they synthesize. For me, I think I've become a lot more comfortable with this bifurcation that oftentimes if somebody sits me down and tries, endlessly, I've heard students say this, mostly in jest, but I think I've absorbed the implicit criticism in this question, where students will tell me like, but what do you actually think? Or what do you actually believe? Because oftentimes if people ask me a question, I'm like, well, according to this opinion, you get this, and according to this opinion, it's this. And if you ask this group of Jews, I'll give you this answer. And like, it's almost become a joke among some students. It's like, no, 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 no. Don't tell me all of that. Like, what do you personally believe about X, Y, or Z? And I realize I'm a lot less comfortable answering those questions because to me, it really does depend on some context of if you catch me at a Shabbat dinner singing Zmirot, what do I actually believe about, the power of Zmirah is going to be different than if I'm talking about, how a lot of these were written and who they were written by and whatever. I don't know if that framework makes sense.
So you see, it does, and a couple of comments on that. The first thing is that when someone asks you a question like that, again, it's very useful to discern the limits of what you think you could know on the subject. In other words, is but what do you know about how God runs the world? And the answer is, well, what can you reasonably expect for a person to be able to know about theology? What can you reasonably expect of us to know about the historical development of religion, of Judaism, of anything? In other words, we think we know some things and we have some good theories about some things, but ultimately a lot remains mysterious, either because it's lost in the mists of time. And unfortunately, it is, by the way, the reason why I like doing 19th century history. I chose the 18th, 19th century history because we know just so much more. We have the text. I'm holding in my hand the physical books that were written then. I can actually say intelligent things about that rather than having to sort of to do a great deal of filling in the blanks.
No, that is fair. And let me push you a little bit more because there is this sort of funny meme that was going around. There's you know a controversy. I don't know if you've heard of Jordan Peterson. Who I'm sure many listeners have thought. So there's this like almost like memeified scene
What do
with
you mean?
him, and he's being asked on a podcast about the historicity or sorry, whether or not it's true that Jesus rose from the grave. And Jordan Peterson very much tries to play both sides of this, fully devout Christian and also full rationalist and whatever. And so they're like, well, did he really rise from the dead? Did that happen? And he sat there and it depends what you mean by happen. And like, maybe there is a little bit of profundity there, but when I listen to that, it's just like, okay, you're just not addressing the fundamental concern that people have. Like, we all know what we mean by, yes, we can have some debate about the philosophy of what it means for something to happen, but like, if somebody's asking you, like at a Shabbat dinner, like, do you believe Jesus rose from the dead? Like, it is a pretty easy yes or no answer in terms of what you believe. Obviously, we're never going to 100% know, maybe Jesus did rise from the dead, right? There is a 0.000, whatever percent chance, I wasn't there, but, I often feel like you could obscure a lot of things that we might know with 90% certainty with just saying, well, does anyone really know about what's happening here?
Hey, one second, but that's actually let's push this example because it's actually not a bad example. If someone goes to you and say, did Jesus rise from the dead? You say, listen, let's consider the different types of evidence that we have. And the historical evidence, how close are the gospels to the actual events and who's reporting and are they contradictory, etc. And the idea of people rising from the dead being a very common literary trope and a very common religious story dating back centuries and centuries way before the gospels, etc., etc. And the fact that in most circumstances, all the circumstances that we know of, men don't rise from the dead. Obviously that's an argument from induction, because I haven't seen all men, and even if all men until now haven't risen from the dead, doesn't mean men won't rise from the dead in the future. Nonetheless, all of these things point me to the and also the rabbis of the time did not accept the divinity of Jesus, did not accept the story of the resurrection, the incarnation, etc. And therefore, all that pushes me to the likely belief, and that is my belief that Jesus did not rise from the dead. However, you could say it is possible that if someone were to have in their own life a very intense experience of uh, divine experience or spiritual experience, which leads them to believe that Jesus is in fact the true Messiah and did in fact rise from the dead. So maybe it would be reasonable for such a person to believe this to be the case, even if it flies against the current evidence that we have in history and the current evidence that we have on our day-to-day knowledge of whether men rise from the dead. Because at the end of the day, those branches, those disciplines can only push us so far in our certainty, right? I think that's not a bad answer. In other words, you can say, you can analyze, you can evaluate the reasons for what you say. Even belief in God. You put Jesus to one side because that's maybe a little bit to the, but reasons for belief in God. So you say, okay, there's the philosophical reasons. There is the historical, religious possible reasons. There are different ways to adjudicate. You say what the different factors are, or modes of analysis. You say, okay, and it's reasonable to think this and less reasonable to think that. And at the end of the day, all this amounts to a case that I personally find compelling that God exists. However, you could say that other factors militate against it. And even though I think I'm right, I would see why factors A, B, C, and D might lead you to the contrary to conclusion. I think that is a very reasonable and responsible way of having that kind of conversation.
Yeah,
Without
there's a famous philosophic essay, maybe written like 30, 40 years ago called, What It's Like to Be a Bat by
Thomas Nagel.
by Thomas Nagel, where he essentially makes the argument that you can know everything about factually what it is like to be a bat, and you still will have no idea what it's like to have the subjective experience of being a bat. And, I totally agree with this framework to, practicing Judaism, right? Like you can take a person and download in that person, right? Let's say some futuristic, AI fusion, and that person could have downloaded every single thing ever written on Shabbat in human history, right? It's a lot of books, right? Everything from the theory to the,
Written about Shabbat.
yeah, everything about Shabbat, right? All the laws and everything, right? If that person has never celebrated a full Shabbat, I would guess the majority of the Jewish community would say, like, this person might be knowledgeable about Shabbat, but this person actually has no idea what Shabbat is all about. And I think again, this does get to. So yes, I think I do totally agree with that distinction. This is though a much more modern, much more, I'm thinking almost of like William James, the pragmatist school of thought of like, you know, Shabbat is holy because Shabbat has the effects of making us into a holy state of mind, as opposed to another view that might say Shabbat is ontologically holy, irrespective of whether or not humans exist or not, right? And I think that there is that interesting argument to be had as well.
It is interesting, although I've never understood why those have to be in tension or contradictory. In other words, you could say Shabbat's actually an excellent example because nowadays, the year 2025, it's so obvious that there's a need for it, right? The fact that we are utterly addicted to our technological devices every single day of the week, and our phones are buzzing, and our computers demand our attention, and our everything that we have. So we could make an excellent argue for the practical, material, and social benefits of having a Sabbath day, 24-hour period. We shut everything off. We meet only in person. We have long meals. We have long walks. We pray. We meet. We play games. We have fun together. That has unbelievable benefits in a rapidly atomizing and technologically addicted society. You can actually make the case. But you could also say that this has no necessary bearing on whether, if you call, let's say, it's ontologically holy or not, meaning is it invested with divine thing, meaning it could be yes and it could be not, but it's just a different question. It's distinct to my mind. Now, of course, one could say I will choose to given our potential ignorance of whether Shabbat is ontologically holy, whether it's invested from the beginning Tchila Mikra Kodesh, whether it's from its very inception invests with some sort of divinity, maybe not, and you can sort of quibble about that, but it's perfectly rational to make to decide to keep Shabbat based on its current social benefits, even if you're not sure about the ontological benefits. And the truth is this, people often say, people like religion because it's socially beneficial or psychologically beneficial. And the answer is, yeah, that might be true too, but that doesn't help or hinder the case for it being true. In other words, it's a nice side effect. I'll take it, thanks. But I just don't see why it has to push
No,
in
no,
one
totally.
direction.
Yeah, they're totally two different claims. But the nafka or the practical, at least legal, difference that if somebody only had that view, if
Mhm.
they were in a situation which many contemporary Jews find themselves in, where Shabbat isn't that beautiful picture you just described, which I totally agree with, which is family and friend centric and community centric. Say they live, in an area that has no Jewish community, and anything like that. And if they were to keep, full Shabbat, they would actually, maybe they live alone and would find it actually a very isolating experience, and and everything like that. The nafkamina is, if you're, if they're listening to you and that's the only glimpse of Shabbat that they have, they might say, okay, great, I'll just drive down the street to a shul, or something that's against the halachic ethos of Shabbat, but more in the spirit of Shabbat there, which is again, this route. I think I didn't think of this ahead of time, but just to call back one more time, and then, I'll see if you have any final thoughts or any final directions that you want to move in. This really was, I think I only recently appreciated, because I remember learning about this in high school about, yeah, you had this medieval debate and some rabbis were trying to give reasons for the commandments and other rabbis were against giving reasons. And I think I only realized how profound that debate is in the last couple of years of, wow, this is more than just, can we ever actually figure out why, pork is not kosher, or is it just, from God and don't question it. But it really gets into the entire philosophy of practice of Judaism, because if we do say that, yes, we could give emotional, social, historic reasons to everything, then I think it really will depend on, your exact circumstance. And you could totally get why a contemporary non-Orthodox Jew, would say, of course, my celebration of Shabbat involves driving to family and friends and driving to synagogue and, maybe listening to inspirational, music and podcasts on Shabbat, all the things that somebody that was more on the halachic side of things would be like, no, what are you doing? It's of course better to stay at home all day on Saturday, you know, alone on your couch than it is to drive to synagogue. And it really just depends on, is this about the reason centric, for Shabbat, or is Shabbat, again, just to use a term from before, some qualitatively different ontological space where, it doesn't actually make a difference what your subjective feeling of Shabbat is. Like, sorry, Shabbat is Shabbat, whether you like it or not, versus Shabbat is here for all these other reasons. And so if you have to, tailor the laws a little bit to actually fit those reasons, and, you sort of, not only can you do it, but like, of course you should do it. Meaning, from the point of view of a contemporary reform rabbi, they would say, if it's between sitting at home all day by yourself on Saturday, reading a newspaper, whatever, or like, rearranging, organizing your apartment, or driving to synagogue and engaging in Torah study and then engaging in services and then having Shabbat lunch at the synagogue. And they would say, it's no brainer. Of course you do that. So, one, you can for sure address that. And then if there's any other moves you want to make, I know the clock is ticking and you actually have your own podcast to record. So we can start to come in for a landing.
So I would say as far as I think that many of the questions and subjects we've broached until now can be neatly tied up with the works of one of the most interesting and creative of modern Jewish philosophers, died only a couple decades ago, which is the Israeli philosopher Yeshaya Leibowitz, because he both understood very deeply this argument of reasons for commandments versus not reasons for commandments, and also saw the value in circumventing, or in fact, completely blowing it up, completely destroying it. Because his position was that the Kantian position, just transposed into Judaism, the Kantian ethical position, just put it very briefly, is that motivations are everything when it comes to moral acts, and therefore, if you're doing a moral act for any reason other than the fact that it's a moral act, it's not a real moral act. In other words, if you're giving charity because it makes you feel good about yourself, or because you think it'll impress a girl, or whatever it is, you're not really doing the moral act, even if you are in fact giving charity, because the whole point is that you're supposed to give it almost against your will. Like it's something that you have to overcome any possible self-interest or any other reason, just do it purely because it is the moral thing to do. That is the essence of a moral act. And John Leibowitz had this notion that every single mitzvah, every single good deed that any Jew does ever is to be done purely and exclusively and only for the reason that God commanded it. It is pure submission, pure obedience, pure removing oneself and one's own desires from the center, and placing the desires of God, placing the worship of God at the very center of everything. And so, for example, let's go back to the charity example. If you're giving it gets even worse. For Leibowitz, if you give charity to a poor person on the street because they're poor and you think it's a good thing to do and you want to give them lunch, then you've done a good thing, but you haven't done a religious thing. You haven't done a religious act. You haven't done a mitzvah. What you've done is an ethical act, which is nice, but you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, the religious act of charity, because a mitzvah, the religious act, requires you to take all possible motivations and all possible theories and everything to one side, throw it away, and do it purely and only because God command you to. In fact, you're supposed to give the charity to the man, and you're supposed to hate the person and hate charity and hate ethics. I'm doing this because I have to. I'm doing this because God commanded me. Obviously, I'm satirizing.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, this philosophy reaches this sort of apex in the Akeda narrative, right? Genesis 22, where, unlike a lot of other thinkers that, starting off from the Midrash already, 1800 years ago, who found this story troubling of how can God, ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, Leibowitz's approach is essentially, this is the highest symbol of Judaism, this act, because specifically what you're talking about, you're doing something for the pure, unadulterated aspect of doing it without any ulterior motives, which of course we're screaming in Abraham's ear against this.
So why is this important to our conversation? Because what this does is it sets up a kind of Judaism where the practice is the basis, and all possible philosophies and all possible theories are kind of sandcastles built on top of it. In other words, what for Leibowitz is Judaism is the practice of a set of laws because God commanded it. And then on top of it, you can build a Kabbalistic theory. On top of it, you can build a Maimonidean theory. You can be a rationalist. You can be a mystic. You can be anything in between. You can have any theories you want, and that's fine. That's cool. It's not whatever you want. You can be the cleverest man on earth. But the point for Leibowitz is that everything is built on this foundation which unifies everything else, right? And in a way, historically, he's correct, because what allowed for Judaism, at least classical Judaism, to remain in many ways a singular phenomenon and not break off into 1,000 little pieces is because all of the grand philosophies and theorizings of Maimonides and of the Kabbalists and of everyone in between them, every rationalist, every mystic, etc., was all trying to give a kind of credence to a way of life, which was a practice of a certain set of things. And if you practice that certain set of things, then that's what made you part of the Jewish community. Again, this is sort of pre-modern, pre-19th century, etc. And so I think that such a worldview, even if we don't have to go the full Leibowitzian hog of, denying all value to ethics and denying or denying all religious value to anything other than the service of God, nonetheless, I think when having this conversation with students, let's say, is worthwhile noting that the practice in many ways comes first. That actually, the Jewish way, you say, oh, how do I understand what prayer is? The answer is you pray. You pray and you pray and you pray and you pray. And at a certain point, or simultaneously with doing that, you can build theories. But the truth is that the philosophy that you build today might not be the philosophy that you favor next year or the year after. And your ideas might change, and your theories might change, and maybe God listens in this way, and maybe it's a self-fulfilling thing, and maybe it's Maimonidean notion of prayer, or maybe like the Kabbalists, you think you're affecting some kind of grand restitution between these 10 divine aspects that are in dubious balance with each other, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, you're still praying. At the end of the day, you're still going to shul, you're still down, you're still doing this thing. And so I don't know if that's the answer, but it is a perspective that's worthwhile putting in there as a kind of a representation of why Judaism has remained coherent for so long.
I think that's a really beautiful summary. I'll plug your podcast so you don't have to do it, because I really, as I told you before we started recording, it really is probably is the single most podcast that I send around to people whenever they ask, very specific questions about different Jewish thinkers or Jewish history. It's the podcast of Jewish Ideas. You can find it on Apple and Spotify and all the normal podcast places. Is there anything else that we did not touch that you think is germane to this conversation, or just anything else you wanted to spend, I don't know, a minute or two discussing?
The answer is, of course, that the amount of things that we didn't touch in this podcast is enormous, and didn't really barely scratch the surface of many of these things. I don't think so. Obviously, people can email me or can email you for follow-ups for these things, because every subject that we touched on has been dealt with quite deeply and quite exhaustively, but with depth and with nuance and with intelligence by many good thinkers and writers. And therefore, if you want to dig deeper, I recommend you do, because these are very interesting sort of fields for discussion and discovery. But I think this will suffice for now until next time, until we decide to do this again in the future. This was a lot of fun. So thank you for having me on.
Of course, amazing. Well, then when I get feedback and people start asking me questions, I'll have to rope you in maybe at the end of the summer for another episode. But JJ Kimche, thank you so much.
Thank you.